Okay, ready to dive in. Today, we are tackling World War II.
Sounds ambitious.
It is, no doubt about it. We're talking about the deadliest conflict in history, 80 million lives, genocide, the atomic bomb.
It's really hard to overstate the impact. Even today, so much comes back to WWII.
Right. And we're going to try to make sense of it all. We're using the American Yawp as our guide. It's a great historical resource.
Collaborative, constantly evolving.
Exactly. So our mission is to distill the key insights, give you the big picture. Now, most people think 1939, Europe, right?
Or maybe Pearl Harbor.
But it actually starts way earlier. Asia, in particular.
Yeah, the U.S. joins in 41, Europe's at war by 39, but Japan, they'd been at it for almost a decade by then.
Which brings us to the Manchurian incident, September 1931. Sounds small, but huge implications.
It's amazing how these things start. A localized event that snowballs into global conflict. So in this case, the Japanese military blows up their own railway.
Wait, their own railway?
Yep. The South Manchuria Railway near Shenyang. Then they blame the Chinese nationalists, use it as an excuse to invade Manchuria.
Wow. So by 1932, they've got control, set up a puppet state, Manchukuo.
Right, Manchukuo. With Kui, the last emperor of China, as their figurehead.
That's a bold move. And you said this had long-term consequences?
Huge ones. This little incident sparks a 13-year war between Japan and China. 35 million casualties. It's crucial to understanding Pearl Harbor and the whole context of WWII.
So why did Japan do it? What was driving this aggression?
Well, Japan was in trouble economically. Resources were scarce. There was internal debate. Some wanted expansion to go grab what they needed, like Manchuria. Others wanted cooperation, a pan-Asian sphere.
To counter the West.
Right. But the military, the pro-war faction, they win out. They see conquest as the answer, the path to regional dominance.
So how did the rest of the world react to this?
China appeals to the League of Nations. The U.S., under the Stimson Doctrine, says we don't recognize this land grab. The League investigates, finds Japan guilty.
What does Japan do?
They leave the League of Nations, 1933. Basically say, see if we care.
That's a big step, a real rejection of international norms.
It emboldened the radicals in Japan. They said, look, diplomacy failed. We got what we wanted with force. The military took over policy, and China became their main objective.
And that leads to a full-scale invasion in 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident.
On July 7th, 1937, Japan invades. The Chinese army, they're overwhelmed. Beiping falls, Shanghai, then the capital, Nanjing.
And the rape of Nanjing. It's almost too horrific to talk about.
It's essential. We acknowledge it, though. It happened. Between 250,000 and 300,000 civilians massacred. Mass rape. Unthinkable brutality.
Chiang Kai-shek's government then adopts the scorched earth strategy. Desperate times, huh?
It was. Destroying anything that could be useful to the Japanese. They retreat inland to Chongqing, burn villages, destroy roads, even divert rivers.
Tough on the Chinese people, though.
It was. It slowed the Japanese, but it alienated a lot of Chinese. And it inadvertently helped the Chinese Communist Party.
So where was the U.S. in all this? Seems like we were just watching.
Pretty much. The U.S. in the 1930s, no desire to get involved. Isolationism was strong after WWI. Plus, our military wasn't ready. Japan was way ahead in terms of technology.
But China tried to get our help, right? Madame Chiang was quite a presence.
Oh, absolutely. Madame Chiang was a force. Fluent English, she understood America, appealed directly to Washington. But all we did was condemn Japan, no real action.
Interesting contrast with the Chinese communists, though. They were gaining power under Mao Zedong.
While the nationalists fought the Japanese, the communists built their strength in the north. They saw an opportunity.
This leads to a very uneasy alliance between the nationalists and communists, but a stalemate in the war.
They couldn't push Japan out, but they stopped their advance. Brutal stalemate. And while all this is going on in Asia, Europe is brewing its own disaster.
Europe is still reeling from WWI. The Great Depression hits, things are bad, a perfect storm for extremism.
You get economic chaos, people get desperate, that's when the radicals thrive. Enter Hitler and the Nazis. They offered a toxic mix. Racial supremacy, fascism, and military expansion.
And they came to power legally.
1933, Hitler becomes chancellor. They shut down democracy, crush opposition, throw the Treaty of Versailles, and they start rebuilding their military, remilitarizing the Rhineland.
It wasn't just Germany either. Mussolini and Italy, they were flexing their muscles too.
Fascist Italy jumps into the Spanish Civil War, backing Franco. Europe is a tinderbox by this point. And Hitler's ideology, it's all there in Mein Kampf. He laid out his plans.
It's chilling to read now, knowing what happened. Uniting all Germans, conquering the East for Lebensraum, wiping out the Untermenschen.
He wanted a greater German Reich,
Hmm.
And Lebensraum, living space, meant taking land from others. Those deemed inferior were expendable. It's a blueprint for genocide.
And he starts putting it into action. Austria in 1938, then Czechoslovakia. Britain and France try appeasement.
The Munich Agreement. Give Hitler the Sudetenland, hope he'll be satisfied. Avoid war at all costs.
But it backfires spectacularly.
Of course it does. Hitler takes the rest of Czechoslovakia in 39. Shows everyone appeasement doesn't work. But by then, he's eyeing Poland. And Britain, France, they finally say enough.
And then, out of nowhere, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Stalin and Hitler making a deal.
A non-aggression pact, but secretly they carve up Poland. It stunned the West. For Hitler, no two-front war. For Stalin, time to prepare and some extra land.
So September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland.
And 2 days later, Britain and France declare war. WWII begins. Germany unleashes the Blitzkrieg. Lightning War, totally different from the static trench warfare of WWI.
Fast, mobile, overwhelming force. The results speak for themselves.
Poland falls in 3 weeks, then France even quicker. The Germans are in Paris by June 1940.
It was a shock to everyone. The speed and brutality of the Blitzkrieg, no one was ready for it.
The Allies were completely outmaneuvered. The attack through the Ardennes, brilliant but completely unexpected. The French defenses crumbled.
So France falls, and Hitler turns his attention to Britain, Operation Sea Lion. But first, he needs to win the air war. The Battle of Britain.
July to October 1940. The Luftwaffe goes all out, trying to destroy the RAF. Airfields, radar stations, then cities. The Blitz begins, but the British hold on.
Churchill rallies the nation. We shall fight on the beaches, and so on. It's a defining moment.
The RAF pilots, outnumbered, under constant attack, they never give up. At radar, that was crucial. They inflicted heavy losses on the Luftwaffe. Hitler had to call off the invasion.
But the bombing continues, doesn't it? The Blitz terrorizes British cities for months.
The Luftwaffe can't get air superiority, so they shift to terror bombing. Night after night, London, Coventry, other cities are pounded, but it doesn't break the British spirit.
And then Hitler makes another big gamble, Operation Barbarossa, June 1941. He invades the Soviet Union.
Breaks the non-aggression pact. He wants it all. Ukraine's grain, the Caucasus oil fields, and to destroy Stalin's military might. He thought it'd be another quick victory.
But Russia's a different beast altogether.
The sheer size of the place, the tenacity of the Red Army, and the winter. Hitler underestimated all of it. At first, the Blitzkrieg works. They capture huge amounts of territory.
But the Soviets fight back.
Scorched earth. They destroy anything that could be useful. Move their factories east. And then the winter hits. The Germans are freezing. Their supply lines are stretched thin.
Leningrad, Stalingrad, Moscow. Huge bloody battles that turn the tide.
The German advance is stopped. And the casualties. Massive on both sides. The Eastern Front was meat grinder. 25 million Soviet soldiers and civilians dead. 80% of German military casualties happened there.
It's often forgotten how much the Soviets sacrificed to defeat the Nazis.
The scale of their suffering is hard to comprehend. They broke the back of the German army. And while this is raging in the East, the U.S. is getting drawn into the fight in the Pacific.
We'd already started putting economic pressure on Japan. They weren't happy about it.
1939, we let the trade treaty lapse. 1940, the embargo, oil, steel, rubber. We wanted them to stop their aggression.
But it backfires.
Big time. Japan sees this as a threat to their very existence. Instead of backing down, they go on the offensive. They want to secure those resources themselves.
And they established the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere.
Right. This idea of a Japanese-led Asia. It was propaganda, of course, but it served their purpose.
So tensions are rising, diplomacy is failing, and then December 7th, 1941.
Pearl Harbor. A carefully planned surprise attack. They wanted to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet, buy themselves time to consolidate their gains.
It was a devastating blow. Over 2,400 Americans killed, ships and planes destroyed.
But it also backfired strategically. It woke up a sleeping giant. A date which will live in infamy, as Roosevelt said. Isolationism dies overnight. We're at war.
Against Japan, then Germany and Italy declare war on us a few days later.
They were allies. And Japan doesn't stop at Pearl Harbor. They attack the Philippines, Hong Kong, all across the Pacific. We're on the defensive at first.
So what do the early stages of U.S. involvement look like?
We start sending aid to Britain. Lend-Lease. They're holding on, but it's a close call. Meanwhile, Hitler unleashes his U-boats, the wolf packs.
To cut off supplies.
Right. The Battle of the Atlantic was critical. The U-boats were inflicting heavy losses. But we win in the end.
Wow.
Better tactics, technology like sonar, and we crack their codes. The Ultra Project was huge. Plus, convoys, heavily armed escorts. By 43, the U-boat threat is basically contained.
Then we get U.S. troops on the ground in North Africa.
Right.
Operation Torch, 1942.
It was a learning experience for the Americans. The British had already turned the tide at El Alamein. But Torch was our first big ground operation in Europe.
And it was a success.
We land in Morocco and Algeria, push east and west, link up with the British. By May 43, the Axis are out of North Africa.
The Casablanca Conference happens around then. Roosevelt and Churchill.
Big decisions made there. They decide to invade Italy, the soft underbelly, and they announce unconditional surrender. No more negotiating with the Axis, total victory.
And while the ground war is happening, we start the strategic bombing campaign, round-the-clock attacks on Germany.
The U.S. Army Air Force does daylight precision bombing, targeting factories, oil refineries. The RAF does nighttime area bombing, hitting cities.
Devastating for Germany, but dangerous for our crews.
The bomber losses were high at first. Flying without fighter escorts, they were sitting ducks for the Luftwaffe.
Yeah.
But then the P-51 Mustang comes along, changes the game.
Long-range escort keeps the bombers safe.
And the bombing campaign really starts to cripple Germany. Production drops, morale plummets. But it's not cheap. A lot of brave airmen lost.
Then, late 43, the Tehran Conference, the Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin.
And Stalin has one big demand, a second front in France. He's been carrying the load in the East, wants the West to share the burden.
And we agree.
Eventually. Churchill was hesitant, but Roosevelt saw the need. Planning for D-Day begins.
But first we have Italy, which turns out to be tougher than expected.
The soft underbelly was anything but. Mountains, tough defenders, it was a slog. The Anzio landings, those were rough, heavy casualties.
But we do eventually push through.
Mussolini is overthrown. Italy surrenders in 43. But the Germans fight on. It takes until the very end to clear them out.
And then June 6, 1944, D-Day, Operation Overlords, the biggest amphibious landing ever.
An incredible feat of planning and logistics. Eisenhower knew the risks, the potential for disaster. But it succeeds. We get ashore at Normandy. The liberation of France begins.
It's still a tough fight, though.
Oh, absolutely. The Germans fought hard, but they were outnumbered, outgunned. Paris is liberated in August. The Allies push east, and the bombing continues relentlessly.
The final phase of the war in Europe, Germany's getting squeezed from both sides.
December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last gamble. A massive counteroffensive in the Ardennes.
Caught us by surprise.
It did. It made some gains, but it failed. Huge casualties for the Germans. They couldn't sustain it. Meanwhile, the Soviets are rolling westward, taking revenge for what happened in their country.
Early 45, the Yalta Conference, the Big Three again. Planning for the post-war world starts.
Unconditional surrender is reaffirmed. The division of Germany discussed. But it's clear the war is almost over. The Soviets capture Berlin in May. Hitler commits suicide.
May 8th, 1945, VE Day. Victory in Europe. But the Pacific War is still raging.
The focus shifts. But the early part of the Pacific War was rough for the U.S.
We lost the Philippines. The Bataan Death March was a horrific chapter.
The Japanese were on the move, and we took some heavy blows. But then, the tide turns. Coral Sea, Midway. Two huge naval battles that change everything.
1942, a crucial year in the Pacific.
Coral Sea stops a Japanese advance on Australia. But Midway is the real turning point. We sink 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. They never recover from that.
Their offensive power is broken.
It is. They can't launch any more big attacks. The U.S. takes the initiative, starts the long road back.
And that's where island hopping comes in.
Also called leapfrogging. We bypass heavily defended islands, take the ones we need for air bases. We advance steadily towards Japan, cutting off their supply lines.
A war of attrition, basically.
It was brutal. The fighting in the Pacific was particularly fierce. The Japanese, they had a different mentality. No surrender, suicidal charges.
And on our side, a lot of racism played into it.
It did. This idea of the Japanese as subhuman, it led to atrocities on both sides, made the fighting even more savage. The jungle environments were horrific too.
Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Iwo Jima, key battles, all incredibly bloody.
Guadalcanal was our first big offensive, a long, hard fight. The Philippine Sea, a huge naval air victory. Iwo Jima, a tiny island, but it cost us over 26,000 casualties.
And by 1945, we can bomb the Japanese mainland.
B-29s, long-range bombers, firebombing raids, city after city. Tokyo, March 1945, an estimated 100,000 civilians killed. The destruction was unimaginable.
And then Okinawa, June 1945. Another bloody fight, but it puts us within striking distance of Japan.
Operation Downfall, the invasion of Japan, was being planned, but the casualty estimates were terrifying. 500,000 American dead, millions of Japanese. It would have been a bloodbath.
And that's the context for the Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb.
It's a race against time. We thought the Germans were working on it too. A massive top-secret project, and it worked. The Trinity test, July 1945, proved it.
And then August 1945, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. 2 bombs, hundreds of thousands dead. A decision that still haunts us today.
The justification was ending the war, saving lives.
Right.
But the moral implications are huge. Did we have to do it? Could we have achieved victory another way? These questions are still debated.
After the bombs and Soviet declaration of war in Japan, Emperor Hirohito surrenders.
August 15, 1945. Then the formal surrender on the USS Missouri, September 2nd. The war is finally over. But the world is forever changed.
So let's talk about the individual experiences. Millions of Americans served.
Almost 18 million. A huge mobilization. At first it was volunteers, but then the draft kicked in. Millions were conscripted, trained, and sent off to war.
What was it like for the soldiers? Must have been so different, Europe versus the Pacific.
Completely different. Europe was more conventional, varied terrain, cold winters, but the enemy was familiar. In the Pacific, it was jungle warfare, intense heat, and a fanatical enemy.
And a lot of racism fueled the conflict there.
Absolutely. Dehumanization of the enemy on both sides. Brutal conditions. It was a different kind of war.
And what about the sailors, the airmen? They had their own challenges.
Sailors, months at sea.
Yeah.
Cramped quarters, the constant threat of U-boats, the airmen flying those bombing missions, high altitude, no pressurization, enemy fighters, casualties were high.
The war effort also transformed the home front. The economy boomed, right?
Out of the Depression and into overdrive. Factories switched to war production, unemployment vanished. The government was spending like never before.
Billions, trillions of
The
dollars.
scale was unbelievable. But it worked. We outproduced everyone. It was a crucial part of the victory. But it meant rationing for civilians, shortages of consumer goods.
And everyone was encouraged to buy war bonds.
War bonds, higher taxes. It all helped pay for the war. And it kept inflation under control. The bond drives were huge. Celebrities, everyone pitched in.
The war also brought big changes for women and minorities. Women entered the workforce in huge numbers.
Rosie the Riveter, the iconic image. Millions of women working in factories, shipyards, and they volunteered too. The Red Cross, all sorts of organizations.
And they served in the military too, didn't they?
They did. WAACs, WAVES, SPARs, hundreds of thousands of women in uniform, doing all sorts of jobs, freeing up men for combat. And the nurses, they were on the front lines too.
But black women still faced discrimination, didn't they?
Huge discrimination. Less pay, worse jobs, segregation everywhere, even in the military, quotas, separate units. Same for other minorities. The war brought progress, but inequality remained.
And after the war, a lot of women lost their jobs.
Society wanted them back in the home. The men were back. They needed the jobs. And even those who'd served, they didn't get the same benefits as men.
The war really put a spotlight on racial tensions in America.
It forced us to confront our hypocrisy, fighting for democracy abroad, but practicing discrimination at home. A. Philip Randolph threatened a march on Washington, demanding equal opportunities for black workers.
And that led to Executive Order 8802.
Right. Fair employment in defense industries. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And over 1 million African Americans served in the war.
Mostly segregated units, but they fought bravely.
The Tuskegee Airmen, they proved what black soldiers were capable of. And the Double V campaign. Victory against fascism abroad, victory against racism at home.
And civil rights groups like the NAACP, they grew stronger during the war.
The war energized the fight for equality. CORE is founded using nonviolent direct action. But there were also race riots, like in Detroit. Tensions were high.
And then, of course, the Japanese internment, Executive Order 9066, a dark chapter in our history.
Over 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, imprisoned without trial. Pure racism and war hysteria. They lost their homes, their businesses. It took decades for us to acknowledge this injustice.
And apologize, finally. The 1988 reparations law was a small step towards righting that wrong.
A small step, yes. The Holocaust, too, the scale of it was hard to grasp at the time. In our response, it was slow, inadequate.
We didn't take in as many refugees as we could have.
Anti-Semitism was strong in the U.S. We turned away the St. Louis, a ship full of Jewish refugees, sent them back to Europe.
The Evian Conference was a failure.
No one wanted to take in more refugees. The Wagner-Rogers bill, which would have allowed more Jewish children into the U.S., was defeated. We knew it was happening, but we didn't do enough.
Later, the War Refugee Board did help some people.
We did, but far too late for most. By then, millions were dead. It's a stain on our conscience.
As the war ends, the focus shifts to the future. building a new world order, and a lot of hope for peace.
The UN is born out of that hope. Roosevelt had this idea of the four policemen, the U.S., Britain, the Soviet Union, and China keeping the peace.
But it evolved into something bigger.
The UN Tehran, Dumbarton Oaks, then the San Francisco Conference in 45. The charter is signed, a new era begins. But the Cold War is on the horizon.
And at home, we have millions of veterans coming back. The GI Bill was a game changer.
The GI Bill was huge. Unemployment benefits, education, home loans. It helped avoid a post-war depression, gave veterans a chance to rebuild their lives.
It fueled the economic boom.
It did. Millions went to college, bought homes, started businesses. It created the American middle class as we know it. But of course, not everyone benefited equally.
Discrimination again.
Women didn't get the same access. Black veterans faced huge obstacles. It was a step forward, but it showed how much work was left to be done.
So we end this deep dive with a lot to think about. World War II, it reshaped the world. The U.S. becomes a superpower, but also faces its own internal struggles.
It was a time of heroism and horror, progress and prejudice. The nuclear age begins and the world holds its breath. The echoes of that war are still felt today.
It's a lot to process, but understanding this history, it's crucial if we want to understand the world we live in today and to avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
We have to learn from history, not just remember it. The lessons of WWII are more relevant than ever. So we leave you with this. What lessons do you take away? How does this history inform your understanding of today's challenges?
We'd love to hear your thoughts.